Hey there guys, as you can see the shipping container shop awning is still not finished, but I am pretty confident it's going to be done sometime in the next 2 weeks. So in the meantime, I figured I would do a quick Q&A video on some of the most common questions that I get regarding my metalworking and welding related projects. But before I start, I do want to give the quick disclaimer that I am not a professional by any means, as you could probably tell by some of my projects. So take whatever I say as just opinion, with a grain of salt or a shot of whiskey, whatever you need. So let's get started. Alright, so I think I'm going to start this off with probably the easiest question to answer, and that is from folks wanting to know what the red arrows are that I use on my metalworking projects. And quite simply, they are just magnets. They are meant to hold pieces of metal into position while you tack them together before you do your full welds. They have a preset 45-degree angle. They can also be placed where they will give you a 90-degree angle. And then they have the ability to be placed into positions where you can get kind of odd angles just by setting them up there and causing a little friction. So really you can use these to hold parts and pieces in whatever position you need them, tack them into place, and then finish your welds after you've taken them off. Another question that I get quite often is from folks wanting to know what the saw is that I use to cut steel in my metalworking projects that produces little to no sparking, and that is this saw. This is the Evolution Power Tools Rage 2 chop saw. It uses a 14-inch carbide toothed blade, and the motor runs at a slightly slower RPM so as to not produce excessive heat, and it produces super accurate cuts, and ever since I got this is pretty much my go-to saw for anything metal related. The saw that I used before this was just your standard 14-inch abrasive wheel chop saw. It certainly will cut steel, but it does not do it accurately as the abrasive wheel moves around a lot and it throws a ton of sparks. So if somebody was looking at these two options, I would definitely say don't get this one. I don't think it's worth using. And to spend the extra money and get something like this would be about 220 bucks at Home Depot, and this would cost you around 100. But if you didn't want to spend that, you can easily get just as accurate of cuts as a saw like this by using an angle grinder with a thin cutoff blade and just simply marking your lines and spending a little extra time scoring them. And I've gotten really good results from something like this. And to follow that saw question up, I also get a question from a lot of people if I use a special blade when I cut aluminum, and the answer to that is no. I just use the same carbide tipped wood blade that I use when I cut plywood or other various types of wood, and I just use the same saws that I use. This is a battery operated circular saw, and this is a piece of aluminum. It cuts through relatively easily, and here is some 1/8 inch thick aluminum diamond plate, and it'll do the same thing. Now I will say this will dull your blades quicker than wood will, but you really don't need anything super fancy other than just a good carbide tipped wood blade. So what is the best type of welder for a beginner to start out with? Well, that is highly dependent upon what somebody wants to accomplish with their welding. And right off the bat, I would eliminate both stick welding and TIG welding. TIG is going to be for more advanced welders looking for specialized applications and really precision welds, like say building a race car chassis or some sort of parts that are being machined. And then stick welding is going to be for outdoor structural things, as well as farmers and ranchers that are welding, say, heavy 1/2-inch steel on loaders and tractors and different things like that. That is definitely something you could start out with, but it's just very application specific, and I don't see most people wanting to do stuff like that as they're beginning. So I really read that question as should someone start with a wire feed welder in flux core wire or a wire feed welder with MIG wire and a bottle of gas? The cheapest route is probably a flux core welder that just does flux core, and you'll have a spool of wire in the welder that is pushed up through a nozzle like this, and the wire, as it's burned, creates a gas that protects the weld as it's going. And then a MIG welder does the exact same thing. There's a spool of wire that gets pushed up through a nozzle like this, but instead of the wire burning and creating a gas, there is a bottle of gas on the back. It will require a regulator, and a MIG welder is going to be a little more expensive than a flux core welder. But out of those two, I would almost always universally recommend just spending the extra money and going for a dedicated MIG welder. This welder specifically is the one I use in all of my videos. It is a multi-process welder. It does TIG, stick, MIG, and flux core, but I use it probably 75 to 80% of the time in MIG format with that bottle of gas on the back. It's a 75-25 mixture. But anyway, back to the flux core versus MIG recommendation. The reason I would recommend spending the extra money and just doing a dedicated MIG machine is because it will provide the best results that will hopefully satisfy most people. When you use flux core, you will tend to get a lot more spatter. Some people will say like it's popcorn around the weld, and if you're okay with all that, that's okay. Then that's really a cheap way to get into it. But if it's going to bother you like it bothered me on my very first project, which was my front yard fence, I spent hours and hours grinding all of that popcorn off. So if I would have just started out with the MIG welder, I probably would have had a lot nicer welds, and I wouldn't have been as frustrated in the beginning. And that's why I would recommend MIG, because I feel like it gives you a nicer entry into welding, and I think more people would be satisfied and not get as frustrated versus say doing flux core and really getting frustrated and just giving up and ended up selling it on Facebook or Craigslist or something like that. I would prefer that somebody get into it and have an enjoyable experience. So I would recommend a wire feed welder in MIG with a bottle of gas, even though it's going to be a little bit more expensive. To remove rust on metal, there's a lot of different options. There's vinegar baths, there's rust removal solutions, but most often I like to just use a wire wheel like this. This hooks directly to your angle grinder and just physically removes the rust. But after a while, some of these wires start breaking down and you'll get the wheel that looks like this and it starts getting wobbly. So in that case, what I like to do is keep some of my old flap discs on hand. This is a double flap disc, and I don't necessarily use a new one of these to remove rust, as they are pretty expensive and they're great for doing lots of grinding and smoothing of metal. But I save the old worn out ones that look like they have pretty much no grit left on them, but I've found that these still actually do a great job of removing light rust when I would have just thrown them away when they hit this stage. So this next question is really going to be answering two questions in one, with the first question being from folks wondering if it's worth the extra expense to purchase a nice auto darkening welding helmet like this Forney Pro Series versus just using a fixed shade welding helmet like this. Now, this is not something you're going to be able to see on store shelves, but it was the only example of a fixed shade helmet that I have. This was originally my wife's grandfather's and is probably 40 to 50 years old, and it was all rotted and cracked, and I just rebuilt the shell with Kydex and leather and copper rivets. I think it looks pretty cool. And for about 2.5 years I used this, and it definitely works. I welded with it, but it's just not convenient. If you want to see through it to grind or do anything like that, you got to flip the visor up or just take it off, and it works, but it's just not convenient. Versus this Auto Darkening Pro Series from Forney, which is the most comfortable and clearest welding helmet I've ever used in my life. It's super lightweight, and it is so clear that I can read the LCD screen on the camera. It's saying 111, 112, 113, 114, And I can't even do that with my sunglasses when I'm looking at that. So it is almost crystal clear, very little tint, except obviously when you're welding, the tint comes on. And that leads me into the other question, and that question is from folks asking if I had to spend money on one aspect of welding, like gloves or helmet or welder, what would you try to get the best, I guess, spend the most money on? And I would not even say it's the welder. I would say it is the welding helmet or the welding mask. And that the whole reason for that is because if you can't see what you're doing, you could have the nicest welder in the world, and if you can't see where you're putting the puddle, it really is not going to make any difference. It would be the same with having a Ferrari with a windshield that's covered in Vaseline. Well, you can't see where you're driving, so you're really not going to be able to do a very good job and take the car to its limits. So that's my thoughts on this one. Pertaining to questions about safety, I'm also often asked what kind of eyewear that I use, as well as the face mask that I use when I'm cutting or grinding or welding. Well, specific to the eyewear, I don't really have a brand of eyewear that I use, but I do like to try to find the safety glasses that have the little rubber or foam inside that helps make a better seal, so it keeps embers and sparks and shards of metal from going in. And then the face mask that I use is an RZ mask. It has a filter on the inside, and it's just nice because it fits close to your face, which allows me to put my welding helmet on and still use it, and it's pretty breathable and comfortable as well. And this might seem like an odd question to answer, but I'm asked it so often, and that is, what paint do I use on my metalworking projects? And most of the time I use Rust-Oleum Gloss Protective Enamel. I think it's got a good mixture of value and durability, and I've had good luck with it. I like Smoke Gray, which is the lighter gray, and Charcoal Gray if I'm looking for a darker gray. And then I also have been experimenting with their high performance enamel. This was the red that I used on my travel trailer hitch lock, and this dark machine gray. And so far I'm liking these, and with the extra amount in the can, it is almost the same price as these. So I may end up transitioning, just using more of this high performance enamel. Who knows, it could be the exact same stuff that's in these cans, but so far this red hasn't faded a bit, and it's been exposed to the sun for months now. So anyway, Rust-Oleum enamels are what I like. Alright guys, that's going to be it. Hopefully this was helpful and maybe gave you some answers to some questions that you've had when you've seen me working on some of these projects. As I mentioned before, this is by no means a professional opinion on a lot of these things, but just some things that have worked for me and things that I think are important. So hopefully they are helpful. As always, I'd appreciate if you guys hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up if you liked this. Hopefully by the next time you see me, this awning will be up, and check me out on Instagram and all that good stuff. I do have a few projects in the works, I keep saying that, but hopefully over the next few weeks you're going to see them dropping a little more regularly. So as always, I'll see you guys next time.